So, good evening to everyone. Myself, Dr. ChandraiahGopani. I'm Associate Professor in GVPAN Social Science Institute. And I thank you all for attending this online lecture series. On behalf of Satyashodhak Collective, I welcome you all for the lecture series that we have started on Dalit Food Cultures. And food studies and food studies become one of the very important area of study in the social science as well as in humanities throughout the globe. uh, for long back, I mean 1 year back, myself and Dr. Anand Kumar, we began to think to have a very serious engagement on Dalit food cultures or food practices of the subaltern communities. So, so what we have done is 2 months back we have called for the papers, part of that initiative, and we have received the more than 60 to 70 papers, and then we screened and people began to write the papers. So in a way, it motivated us to begin some um, general open discussion on this Dalit food culture, because after Sahu Patole, Marathwada Dalit Kitchens book published by Penguin, it created a lot of interest among the new generation of people. And though there are people, scholars, who have been engaged in studying, critically analyzing the food practices across India, in both in the popular domain as well as in academic sphere. Uh, then we began to think that why don't we have a open online lecture series, so that new generation of scholars, it will be useful to the new generation of scholars. Uh, there has been a big discussion on understanding the Dalit food culture. But when we Google it, most of the times we do not have a substantial academic research, although there are individual articles, particularly around the non-veg, beef, and contestation and all that. Sahu Fatole book brings a the kind of the food practices that they historically developed, the kind of new experiences, the kind of stigma that they have gone, or the hierarchy that exists within the village system or in food practice. So there are series of questions that become very, very important to understand when we began to talk about bringing up volumes on this food culture, and many friends began to ask, how can there be a Dalit food culture? So food everybody eats, how can it be a Dalit? So this also uh, creates a lot of some sort of confusion or some sort of uneasiness. So when we begin to think Dalit food cultures, we began roughly to understand that Dalits historically, because of their socio-economical conditions, carries a very distinct, specific experiences and practices that really distinct from the other mainstream, so-called mainstream communities. And there are incidents where uh, 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 whatever Dalits eat, that sometimes become a contestation. And in fact, the experiences like when Dalit women cook in midday meals, and others are refused to eat. So that means, what is it? When remember, there was a incident in Bombay or Pune, when Dalit woman maid, housemaid, uh, cooked food, and upper caste woman refused and filed a case, in fact. So, and there are experiences like Musar community in North India have a different, distinct food cultures. So, depending on the region, depending on the kind of socioeconomic conditions, there is also no carry those new specific food experiences. And if you read the literature, autobiographies, Om Prakash Valmiki, or other literatures brings these experiences. Therefore, you we have a different philosophy of food, and the stigma that is carried, or the social meanings that are generated. And remember, 10 years back or so, Chandraiah Prasad started a Dalit food a market. So everybody was shocked or surprised, or began to understand what is it. So in a way, it was began to democratize the space, how a mainstream receive it. So there are many questions, and we began to explore. And part of that, we thought of to have a lecture series on Dalit food culture, or food practices of the Dalits, whatever you call it. And these are some of the questions which are very important to understand. And part of this lecture series, we are inviting the people who are already worked extensively. And when we decided to invite Anand, myself, Dr. Rituparna Patgiri, and immediately she accepted, and we are very thankful. On behalf of Satyashodhak Collective, we are very thankful to her immediately accepting our request and willing to deliver her lecture. So, what I do is I request Dr. Anand Kumar, to introduce today's speaker. The format will be, speaker will speak for 40 minutes, 40 to 45 minutes. Then we will have a 15 to 20 minutes discussion. So now I invite Dr. Anand to introduce Dr. Rituparna Patgiri. Thank you very much.
Well, a very warm greeting to everybody present here. Thanks, Professor Gopani, for giving me this opportunity to introduce the keynote speaker of the today's session. Though I am very tiny and very small, a very tiny scholar to introduce such an academician who has a bigger reputation and stature. So I am a bit hesitant, but however, as a formality, we are here to introduce our guest or keynote speaker, Professor Rituparna Padgiri. As the thumbnail of this meet reflect that it is designed not to just inform us about the emerging food studies, but to inspire us to decode the immanent power politics that is very inherent to this, to give us a lens through which we can see this path ahead, not just with clarity, but with excitement and purpose. Since the moment we thought of organizing this meet, we have been juggling with this question of selecting a speaker who embodies the agenda at hand, but thanks to Dr. Rituparna Padgiri, who relaxed our nerves by giving her approval at once for the talk in just one email. So you all must be knowing Dr. Patgiri as an assistant professor of sociology at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Guwahati, but her influence extends far beyond. She is the mind behind the best-selling book, Food, Culture, and Society in India, Social, Political, Economic, and Cultural Perspective, which has fundamentally shifted the dialogue around the sociology of food in contemporary India. You have likely seen her insight featured in social media and print media as well. So, what truly sets her apart, however, is not her just list of accomplishment, which is frankly staggering. It is her unique ability to connect the disparate ideas, to weave together stories and stories of the cuisines and culinary memories, especially belonging to the marginalized communities. So, and at the same time, to present the vision of the future related to this food, humanities, or food studies. So Dr. Patgiri has several awards and accolades into her credit, including Prestige Fellowship, the uh, the Juban Sasawaka Peace Foundation Grant, the Young Researcher from Northeast, and the winner Jen Foundation Grant. Patgiri is also one of the co-founder of Doing Sociology. She served as the associate editor of Society, a journal published by Springer Nature. Patgiri is the convener of the ad hoc group 03, that is a research committee called Food, Culture and Society of the Indian Sociological Society. Her recent paper titled Let Me Take a Photo Before We Eat: The Impact of Digital Technology and Food Production and Consumption in New Delhi, which was published by Sociological Bulletin SAGE in 2025, grabbed much attention in the contemporary academia. So I personally think that every individual who are passionate about understanding the gastropolitics in present society must read it. Dr. Padgiri is also working on two other books, a co-authored volume on sociology of gender in India, contemporary issues and perspective, which is going to publish by Cambridge University Press, and another monograph titled Mobile Theatre of Assam, a story of resistance, consumption, and culture, which is to be published by Rootless. So it is my profound honor and pleasure to invite you all to join me in welcoming today's keynote speaker, Dr. Patgiri. She is here to share a talk entitled Understanding Food Studies in India, Issues and Methodologies. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Rituparna Patgiri. The floor is open to you, Dr. Patgiri, now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anand. You have actually been far more generous than probably what I deserve for an introduction. And, that makes my responsibility even greater. Thank you to Professor Gopani as well. You mentioned that I accepted the invitation immediately. And there is a reason behind it. It is that I saw that Satyashodhak Collective shares my vision of making academic knowledge accessible and also, easily available to everyone, which is a big part of what we aim at doing sociology as well. And that is the resonance I found between our platforms in terms of young people's involvement, independent collective, as well as this idea of accessibility. So I would also like to thank you and Professor Gopani as well as the collective for giving me this opportunity to engage with people who are interested in food. I was fascinated to listen that there were 60, 70 submissions around, food cultures that actually made me think about the surging significance of food studies in India at the moment. Is there a possibility to share the PPT or
From your end, you can share it, or you will share it with me, and then I can share it for the general dialogue.
I think you have to give me permission. The
Okay.
host has to give me permission. Yes. So if you can give me permission, I'll share it.
So, Professor Gopani, can you allow Rituparna ji to share the PPT?
Yeah, it has given. Please
Yes,
check.
thank you. Thank you. Yes. Okay. So, I'm going to talk about understanding food studies in India, issues and methods. Essentially, the idea behind this presentation is to introduce the audience and our viewers to questions of methodology and also how to theoretically think about food, even when one is studying food only maybe amongst a particular community or a village, etc. Now, this is from my personal experience that after I went to Delhi University and Delhi for higher education, what I noticed is there is a significant gap in terms of how people are taught to think in these elite institutions versus how education is imparted, let's say, in the region that I am from, Assam. And this gap is a lot in terms of the theorization and also the methodology. So, very often, what happens is that the work that people in local colleges as well as marginalized communities do, they get appropriated as well as theorized by others. And the reason is simply that many of us can lack the tools to how to think about it. So, in respect to this question of the Northeast, I have often wondered, why can't I find, a thinker from the Northeast to cite on any issue who may be also someone belonging to the Northeast and has not studied outside the region or abroad. And very often it goes back to this question of lack of theorization. And that has actually made me think a lot about how we need to talk about theorization as well as this methodological toolkit from the margins itself, that how can we start thinking about these ideas. And therefore, when Anand suggested that I talk about this particular topic, I said yes, with this idea that let's think about food as a social, political, and cultural lens in terms of its methodological and theoretical abilities to understand society. So very often when you work on something like food, there is this idea that you reduce it to a part of your study. And the titles of perhaps our journal articles, our research papers, they remain very narrow in that sense, because the understanding is that food itself is narrow. So that understanding of how food is seen only as a limited part of the society first needs to be broken. So the idea that I'm proposing is that food is interdisciplinary in the manner that it travels, because it allows almost every disciplinary vantage point to understand society from the way that it wants to. So, this is the first idea that I'm proposing. And what do I mean by that? What I essentially mean by that is that if you are a sociologist, you can adopt a sociological lens which combines the historical as well as the present or the contemporary to understand food and then the larger society. If you are a political scientist, you could bring in a very political narrative. If you are an economist, you can use economic tools. If you are a literature student, you can bring in the literary and the semiotic analysis to understand food. So it is interdisciplinary, and it's also a method and object of inquiry. So, for most of us who might be looking into, let's say, food cultures or particular communities which are marginalized historically, like the Dalits, or indigenous communities in Northeast India, it becomes a tool to capture their larger relationship with the social. So, Professor Gopani mentioned the book Dalit Kitchens of Marathwada, and this book needs barely any introduction now, because Shah Patole was able to sort of reach out to larger sections of the society in terms of what he was talking about. However, what is also interesting is this question that needs to be asked, that, Dalits have historically always existed in Indian society. They've also eaten differently owing to multiple factors, like Patole argues. Then why wasn't there a book on Dalit food practices, throughout India's history? And Professor Gopani mentioned in the beginning that very correctly, when you Google, nothing comes up. And like I was mentioning, nothing comes up when I also talk about the Northeast, And there are certain cookbooks now, there are certain descriptions of food practices of Dalits from Northeast Indian communities, tribal communities. But then the idea behind these books are still descriptive and also talking about, food from a very, very particular lens. Then, when Shahu Patole writes this book, there is an attempt at looking at this question from a position which is from inside the community. So the question that I was asking, that why was this book not written maybe 10 years back or 20 years back, is answered also by the larger question that I'm proposing, that food is not isolated from politics, from society. One sees historically at the moment that there is an assertion, or rather discussion, about marginalized rights, like the blacks in the Western context, Dalits in the Indian context, indigenous communities worldwide. So, therefore, these representative issues, like talking about their food, their culture, they become very, very significant. What is also interesting and perhaps a methodological issue is how this word culture has been historically seen. So, when we talk about culture, historically it has been associated with communities that are dominant. So, if you are a non dominant community, your practices deserve no merit to be understood as culture. That has been the tradition that scholarship has followed. Why has it been the case? Because when we think about marginalized communities, the immediate attention is to study vulnerability, destitution, until and unless that was challenged by scholarship from inside these marginalized communities, that look, you also have to look at us as people rather than only servers of destitution and neglect. There is a change in perspective, and therefore food, culture, these become possible to be studied now after these assertions through scholarly traditions. And of course, the academic scholarship is connected to the politics outside. And therefore, when we are today thinking about food and culture, we are also talking about other communities. So I'm more familiar with the context of the Northeast, and therefore I can actually bring in one example of how we look at this question of food amongst the tribal communities or indigenous communities in the region. As a caste Hindu person, I have grown up hearing how people from tribal communities don't know how to eat or cook food because their food is smelly, or they eat different food items, and therefore they don't have any cultural sensibility. When you grow up hearing these kinds of ideas, it also suggests the reflections of how food and culture are associated, right? So when we are thinking about now, historically, bypassing those ideas of how culture has been thought of in terms of food from the margins, this is also where we are breaking that idea, which is why I was very carefully listening to the introduction on Dalit food cultures, that, why should we focus on what Dalits eat? And Patole, in his book, in the preface primarily, writes something which is very interesting. I'll just read it out. This is the story of the food my parents ate and their parents ate, an acquired taste, especially one acquired through centuries of discrimination. Now, this particular sentence, when he says, basically also tells us and opens up this question of how do we think about food in relation to those larger questions of, vulnerability, discrimination, poverty, destituteness, etc. So when we are thinking about food and culture, and as a sociologist, that's where my interest goes. I immediately think about the social conditions and the context which makes that possible. Why is it that certain communities eat the way that they do? So I will map out this question through the key issues in food studies that I am bringing in terms of questions of hunger, nutrition, and inequality. So today, when younger people and scholars are trying to work on food, many of them are centering their works around questions of caste, gender, labor, markets, media, and economies. However, these issues remain central, that even when we think about the digital space, can we really ignore questions of hunger, nutrition, and inequality? So, how can we sort of, think about them in the contemporary spaces, which present this idea that they are in that way, identity neutral? One of the biggest ways in which the contemporary scholarship has engaged with the digital is to also look at it as a site, if it is connected to the social or it is completely away. And that question again brings me back to this idea of the context in which we are discussing some of these issues. So, questions of hunger, questions of nutrition, questions of inequality, they remain central to how food studies is done. So, when people wrote on food and they did not know that they were doing food studies because there was no such term for it, they looked at these issues in terms of, how they could be entry points to study society. The same thing is also happening today, but at the same time, we are also looking at newer issues. For instance, maybe 20 years back, I wouldn't have been working on digital technologies and food, primarily because there were no digital technologies in the way that we see today. So, this idea of food as a methodological lens and how it links everyday life with structures is something one should really be interested in as an entry point into social processes. Let me use a few examples to actually demonstrate how this could be done. For instance, let's think about a particular way in which Dolly Kikon, in her now very famous essay on dirty food, talks about the two ideas of racism and casteism in the Indian context, and how she sort of, uses food as an entry point to understand these features. Kikon's argument is emerging from her point of view as a Naga anthropologist who has also spent a considerable time in metropolitan cities like Delhi, where she finds food to be used as a tool of humiliation for marginalized communities. And Kikon argues that food becomes a tool of that humiliation, because when you go to rent a house and you ask if there is available vacancy, the questions are mostly centered around, what do you eat? Will you be cooking meat? And then additional questions about, will your food be smelly, right? She argues that the very idea of what you eat, which is central to one's biological being, becomes also a tool to basically humiliate their social presence, because these questions are answered, number one, with a lot of hesitation, and number two, sometimes also with distance. What is this distance? So if I adopt, let's say, a phenomenological as well a feminist approach, I am very tempted to understand this distance as detachment. What happens when you are asking these questions? In many cases, you distance yourself from the community. So, many people, when posed with these questions, that will you be, eating smelly food or cooking smelly food, they say, no, I won't be. I don't eat those food items. I am different. Where is this difference coming from? This is coming from the need to assert your detachment and distancing from the community that you belong to, because there is a matter of humiliation attached to it. So, which is why a very empirical kind of, example becomes a theorizing of the self itself, right? This is one way that I'm demonstrating the use of food as entry point to study larger social structures as well as ideas. You can see how you can, take it ahead to study social philosophy as well. Secondly, I want to use an example from my own entry point as a student in central universities. And I wrote this paper on hostel food. When I was actually maybe much younger, just entering early 30s at that time. And it emerged from this very personal experience with hostel food, where me and my, friends, when we talked to each other, there was a gap in terms of what we thought about hostel food. So for many from regions like, Delhi and Haryana and Rajasthan, they were very okay with the hostel food because it gave them what they ate generally. But for me, as well as for my friends from the region and other communities, they had no personal linkages with the food that we were regularly eating, and very often we would end up either not eating, cooking, etc. Which led me to think about how food served in these very central university hostels, which call themselves to be also liberal spaces as well as unified spaces, how they promote ideas of exclusion. It's not just that food from the margins were not included in the menu. We were also actively discouraged from eating those food items. There were restrictions on certain food items. And then, when there would be special occasions, also, there would not be serving of either meat or any kind of food items from these communities. It was also interesting to see that our foods would not even be named correctly in popular discussions, as there was very little awareness. Now, what this also sort of made me think about is the relationship of food with these larger questions of exclusion, education, etc. Primarily how this idea of the Indian as well as the identity around belonging to this particular country is constructed. Sharing rooms with people from different dominant communities of the region would also make you think about, how there is this understanding of your being as almost invisible. And the idea of how that sort of is communicated through language itself also offers a space to understand food and its methodological possibility of linking everyday life with structures. So when we think about Indian restaurants, it is automatically North Indian food, and that of the dominant communities we think about. We don't think about the margins at all. So this is also one way of entering the understanding of food. And since it was mentioned that there were many young people working on, different kinds of Dalit food cultures, this is perhaps a very potent tool to theorize the way that people from various Dalit communities have eaten. I would also say that if you are from the community and an insider, your positionality itself is an analytical framework. And the way that you are from the community, what you have grown up eating, then how it could be, missing from the representations, but again, seen as political token representations, that also becomes a way to understand, ideas of, let's say, the, positionality of the researcher. So in social sciences at the moment, we are talking a lot about that positionality. And therefore, it's also important to clarify who the person is, how they belong to particular, communities, etc., or not, in terms of talking about the research and its reflexive values. I'll be happy to answer more questions about that in the Q&A if anyone has any. So I want to spend a little time talking about ethnographic approaches because, again, with young people, I see that they mostly say they want to do ethnographic studies because ethnography has also become a very commonly used buzzword. But let me spend a little time talking about what ethnography is, right? Ethnography is actually, as the traditional anthropologists would describe it, a very immersive, understanding of the field, where you stay in the field and you basically do all your activities in the field and you engage in immersive observation. Historically, that is how ethnography has been understood. But now when we think about ethnography, we have to ask ourselves that when we are only doing 15 or 20 interviews, let's say, is it ethnography per se, or is it in-depth interviews as the methodological tool located in an ethnographic world? So I would say it's perhaps actually an ethnographic approach where you're using the in-depth interview as a methodological tool. But what does the ethnographic approach do? It actually makes all of these very routine activities associated with food, like cooking, eating, feeding, feel sites. So they make us see the mundane in a more, research oriented way. I'll go back to that example of hostel food because, I was eating that food every day, or rather, maybe not eating when possible. Uh, it became the site of interrogation for me because of how I was located in that site and connecting to it. For many, that is how the ethnographic approach becomes reliable. So, what we see in our households, in our institutions, in our communities, we see the embodiment, the routine, and the affect of how we are connected to the ideas of food. And therefore, ethnography becomes a very, very important approach to possess when we are looking at food. Food is something which is really connected to our social and physical beings because it is not just about the body and the biological need, but also about what we want to eat, what we feel like eating, etc. Therefore, this ethnographic approach, if rooted also in other philosophical theoretical ideas like phenomenology or feminism, etc., that makes the study of food much more coherent as well as robust. So essentially, you observe social relations that are associated with food. And here again, I want to draw from examples of research that have been done on, let's say, indigenous communities in different regions of the country. So if one sees how indigenous food in tribal areas of Chhattisgarh or basically Madhya Pradesh, the Chota Nagpur Plateau area have been depicted, you will notice that there is an idea of hunger. And how the people of those communities resort to eating certain food items because they are driven by hunger. A point that Patole also makes, that most of the recipes that he describes in this book is also a great collection of recipes. If you have read it, you will know they are recipes which emerge out of destitution. For instance, he talks about this particular recipe, which has these ingredients of khur, yesur, and salt. And he calls this the khur, or the pie, or the paya. And he says that this recipe was a Dalit recipe for people from Marathwada because the dominant caste would not eat the hooves or the trotters of animals, and therefore they would be available for the marginalized communities. This recipe itself is an indication of how the destitution is sort of driving them to eat something similar to the indigenous tribal communities of those regions. Whereas when one looks at the depictions of food cultures amongst indigenous communities in various northeastern states, you will not find this ethnographic representation. And the reason is that the ecological side of this region offers people from indigenous communities relief from that kind of destitution. So, in spite of being marginalized in terms of, let's say, social hierarchy or this question of purity and pollution, their food cultures have been driven by how they relate ecologically to the natural, food products. So they are able to eat different kinds of fish or different kinds of animals which are abundant in this region. And how does this impact our studying of a community? So long back, almost I think 10 12 years back, I was doing a research project with an agency from abroad in Assam, and one they wanted to look at income, equity amongst urban and rural households in certain villages. And one of the questions they had was, how regularly do you eat fish and meat? I was very young then, so I had a lot of hesitation, but I still, gathered the courage to tell them that, can you reframe this question? Because I think in Assam, even if people say that they eat fish or meat regularly, it doesn't say much about their income, because fish is, abundantly available in this region. So what happens is that you may be poor, but you still may have caught fish in the common, rivers and ponds. So they understood how it was different in many communities. So this methodological clarity or understanding of the local emerges from how one knows a particular field site, right? And this also emerges from that outlook of how we think about the communities, etc., in our immersive kind of experience, which we call ethnographic. Essentially, therefore, you see that when we talk about marginalized communities, also there are differences in the way that we think about food. So, while kikons and different kinds of experiences of food from the Northeast would talk about racism as well as ideas of how that food becomes, categorized as dirty and smelly, in those regions where they live, it is a very different experience, which is quite starkingly different from how maybe Dalits experience their food. Primarily also because of the social structures and the ways that society functions. So, if you are looking for studies on food, these are again approaches that one could follow. Then let me talk a little bit about policy and governance approaches, because ethnography can also offer a policy critique. So in policy approaches, what happens is the add and stir approach, where you add a particular scheme or you announce a regulation, but don't really think about how socially or culturally it will be implemented. In the beginning itself, Professor Gopani talked about the midday meal and how when there is a Dalit woman who is a cook, or a widow who is a cook, or when eggs are included in the midday meal, what happens? And we very well know that there are a lot of controversies around these ideas in the midday meals, when the introduction of eggs or a Dalit cook automatically makes the people from upper caste revolt, as well as uh, sorry, there was some distraction. So revolt, as well as question the idea of food itself. Policy wise, these are good approaches to be inclusive, to think about including people from the margins into the schemes. But culturally, ethnography offers us the lens to see how the policy doesn't get actually implemented, because on paper you are being cast neutral or egalitarian, but in the system it is not true. I would say the same about hostel food, because when the policy is framed, it is that we will offer Indian food, we will offer nutritious food, and then when you read that, you feel like, oh, this is so equitable. But it is not, because it is only a certain idea of the Indian that is being promoted, and that Indian idea is rooted in caste and religion, as most of us know. Which is why when one looks at policies, it's also important to look at their social cultural context. I mean, the UGC guidelines are a huge debate at the moment, and the way that the protests have unfolded, anyone with a historical lens would connect it to what also happened during the, Mandal Commission reports, very similar kind of trajectories. And why is the policy being questioned is a reflection of what the social and the cultural context sort of say about a particular social institution, which in this case is caste. And this is similar to how people have approached, stringent measures on sexual harassment laws, etc. as well. So the privileged, when questioned with their positions of power, clamp down heavily and somehow always find a way to manage what, was being first of all given. Essentially, therefore, these two approaches go a lot hand in hand when we think about methods. Unfortunately, because I don't have, a lot of time and it is not possible when it is a lecture, I have made a very, let's say, small remarks about these methods. If anyone wants to know more, they can later get in touch with me via email, and I'll be happy to, share more about them. The textual and the archival methods very, very important, because if we have to uncover the history of margins, these archives offer us something which is that we don't feature in them. So the possibility of, how to get material out, uh, exactly when we think about Dalit food and that question of Googling and not coming up with anything. Similarly, Northeast food or Muslim food, or, you name the marginal categories. Interestingly, the archives don't have a lot. So, what do we rely on then for our sources? Number one, we of course rely on the omissions that, margins are missing. But secondly, we also rely on oral history sources, policy documents, pamphlets, etc. Um, Dolly Kekot refers to this Delhi police pamphlet of 2010, which had, been released by the police department. And it's very interesting because at that time there was a lot of racism against people from the Northeast migrating to Delhi. And a lot was to do with food. So the police took out a manual or a pamphlet which said that tenants and residents should avoid cooking smelly food to not create civic disobedience and law and disorder. Very interesting framing of a problem where you are supposed to not cook smelly food because it can create law and order issues. And this law and order again is actually a very interesting site to observe food. There hasn't been any work at all, so if anyone is interested in that region also, it's a very good entry point to look at food, that how does this question of law get framed. So when there is a clamping down on non-vegetarian food, when there is any festival, let's say, or what has happened with the lynchings in India, the idea is that don't eat it because it is dangerous, which becomes also a way to negotiate with the law, that you give up on certain food items. Primarily that idea of how the archives, the text, they make us think about food in different ways. That is also a methodological entry. Now, the digital methods in food studies, primarily when we think about the digital sites, I don't want to see them as completely disassociated from the social, like I mentioned in the beginning itself. And primarily that is because when we are thinking about the digital methods, we are actually looking at these sites, let's say Instagram or social media platforms, to be very integrally connected. So, questions of representation. The exotic. What is the ordinary and the exotic? That is one question that often emerges in food studies. And what people in the margins eat generally are seen as the exotic. So, what, let's say, a community from Nagaland would eat, that becomes a part of the exotic representation of the community. So, if you do a quick YouTube search, you will find that, if you say Naga food in Nagaland, it's all these exotic images, which will make you wonder that do they not eat every day? Is it only an exotic practice? Which means that this lens of representation has been skewed. because it only manages to capture the exotic and not the everyday. What is happening is that the margins, in this case, the Nagas, they get represented only as exotic eaters of items which are would be otherwise not eaten by a majority of the population, but because you are a tourist or a blogger or a vlogger visiting, you're okay to try it. So trying is also a way of middle class, leisure, sensibility, an assertion of your cosmopolitanism. Because when you don't try, it also means that, you hold on to your traditional identity. And that becomes a way to also theorize and look into food. This is a question that I often get posed with, that how do we increase the acceptance around food and different kinds of food? The acceptance is not about eating what others eat. The acceptance is about tolerating the possibility that they have the right to eat what they want. And that is where this digital archiving, questions of representation, they become very, very significant sites to observe the so-called traditional issues that continue to, exist in food studies. So, in the last few minutes, I want to make a few remarks about, how we think about, let's say, food and how food follows across sites. And these are the major sites in which one can observe both online and offline circulations, as well as this question of power, which could be traced through food chains. So there are a lot of possibilities to do different kinds of engaging research. You could just pick up production and the market. You could just pick up consumption and media. You could also pick up, production and home. And then certain ideas around food get revealed in terms of how do we look at it methodologically and theoretically, right? The politics of how we understand food is something which makes it, let's say, an entry point and not an end point when we are writing. I mentioned dissertation, but it could be a paper, it could be, a book, etc. And there is a possibility to combine different kinds of entry points. And this is something I really stress on, because then it makes food visible from margins. That how do we think about sources? So, can we really write anything on food from margins without really going to the oral historical sources, narratives, etc.? And which is why probably food is one of those areas where the memory becomes so important, because a lot of these descriptions are very memory oriented. They continue to remain, in that sense, a part of who we are, but also who we were. I will end by urging, our younger scholars to think about methodological pluralism, primarily in the way that we can expand our imagination beyond the fact that this community eats this and that community eats this as merely a descriptive idea, but thinking theoretically as well as linking it with larger issues and social structures. So the sentence that I am going to end with is that food generally enables engaged research, and that engagement becomes, socially, culturally, politically, economically potent. Thank you once again to the organizers for giving me this opportunity, and I'm happy to field any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Rituparna Patgiri. It was very interesting and insightful. The way you formulated approaches, what could be the entry point to engage with the food and food studies, no, policy level, digital, and then textual, archival. So there are many ways in which you begin to uh, uh, present as and bringing your own experiences and writings. And we are very thankful for your insightful uh, presentation and lecture. So what we do is I request participants, please message directly to speaker or you unmute and speak briefly, only question, and it should not be disturbed. No,
It's okay, Professor Gopani. There are, I think, two questions. I can address them first.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, please.
yeah. Hello. I think one question is about factors like urban migration mimicking non-Dalit lifestyle also affect the neglect of Dalit food, that is the voluntary distancing with one's food. Right, Neha's question, Dr. Neha Arora's. Uh, okay. Yes. So, I think with migration and urbanization, what has happened as studies on food have shown is homogenization. So, in any part of India or the world, there is a strict homogenization of food, which has meant that we are moving towards adopting mostly mainstream, taste buds. And therefore, even people who are located in the margins and they migrate, they adopt those food practices. It's a lot to do also with the seasonal availability as well as regional availability. So many a times, if I want to eat my food in cities like Bhopal or maybe Chennai. I'm not talking about Delhi and Mumbai, which are more cosmopolitan. You will not be able to buy those vegetables and spices, etc. So essentially, you will have to, in a way, rely on someone coming from the your area to bring food with them, and then sort of engage in it. How one is able to hold on to their food practices is also a result of availability as well as geographical accessibility. And I think when Yasika Dutt talks about caste, she brings in this point about why people from the community want to disassociate from being Dalit. In her book on coming out as a Dalit, she brings this point that, she is very hesitant to talk about her caste identity, even when she has a class position which is privileged perhaps compared to many others, because she fears that it will be attached to then questions of humiliation as well as, oh, this is why you made it because you got reservation, etc. Primarily, one of the reasons why I see that people from the community would try to also blend in when if there is no other option available, because it is also about survival. So this is something that often happens. There is a question about colonial and census practices. Yes, I think a lot of literature already exists on fixing the Dalit identity. That has been something that people have looked at. But why has there been an erasure of the rich Dalit food culture? This is a question which is really interesting. Historically, one of the ways in which this has also happened is because people were not talking about what they ate. And this is again attached to questions of, destitution and humiliation. For instance, even in poorer families who may not necessarily be socially marginalized, if you ask them, what did you eat? It is often met with hesitation. Reason being that, eating, and I'm talking about, let's say, Assam, only dal and rice would mean that you are poor. And therefore, accepting that, saying that becomes a way to also accept your social economic status. So, one was this in terms of, not talking about what people ate because it was different. It could be associated again with ideas of untouchability, impurity, etc. And the second is also the people who recorded these practices, etc. Even when faced with, difference, they refuse to acknowledge it. And this is something which has been documented when you think of tribal studies in India, where when asked of their religions, and if the tribals would say, let's say, I practice this religion or that religion, which is not Hinduism, Christianity, then there would be apprehension that what is this? Perhaps they don't know. And what was the fixation of that identity? That fixation was either backward Hindu or that they are Hindus, right? Whereas now also, if you look at many of these communities, they say that, we have our own religion. But there was also that erasure, which was quite systematic as well as, coming in from that position. Okay,
Hello, ma'am.
there's a question about, yeah,
Yes, ma'am.
sorry,
Uh, my name is Amit Kumar.
yes.
Okay, ma'am. My question is, I want to know your opinion. When you say marginalization of Northeast food in Central University, especially DUGMU, so are you considering Northeast food culture as a shared culture or a homogeneous culture? Because there is internal differences. Because there is a what we say subjugation culture and dominant culture when we comes to food culture. So when you say the representation of Northeast food, uh, which kind of uh, which kind of food culture you are talking? Are you also addressing the differences between dominant food culture and subjugated food culture?
And it's a good question. Thank you. You said your name was Anuj or Amit? Amit, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, the Northeast is a very heterogeneous community, and the food cultures are different in terms of not just the states, but also the communities, and then the dominant caste communities, and then tribal communities. I agree. However, when I said Northeast, I actually say that even the dominant northeastern communities are excluded from the representation in central universities. I come from the caste Hindu Assamese community, which is perhaps the most dominant community in the sense of the numbers as well as power. But even my food was not represented. So in that sense, it's also interesting how categories travel, because there I am from the Northeast, right? Whereas if I'm looking at it internally and as a question of power and privilege, then I have, the privilege of being from a dominant caste Hindu community. But in that space, it doesn't exist. And a lot of it also has to do with how awareness and education, function. Because there have been many instances when I've been asked, in your region, you eat everything. I've heard, you also eat humans. So is this true? And then somebody else will say, no, that is about Nagaland. They don't eat. The person who is saying that thinks that they actually possess the knowledge that others don't eat, but Nagas do. So there is that systematic discrimination within the region, outside the region, within the communities, and then, the representations. So if I have to talk about Northeast and food, then there, what the dominant caste Hindu communities eat again become, representative cuisines. But the question is still slightly different, because caste doesn't work in a similar way in the region, as there is also an intersection with tribe. So these questions become a little more different, which is why the nuances, need to be looked at in terms of the identities. But having said that, I also say that when we think about food in the Northeast, there is complete erasure of how we think about the communities who are marginalized within the region again. So when it comes to these questions of commercialization, etc., we talk about indigenous communities, their rice beer, the pork that they eat. But when it comes to, talking about, let's say, Assamese food culture, we don't bring in those ideas, because again, internally they get ranked hierarchically lower. Pork has become very visible in, let's say, Northeast India and Assam. But if one looks at the history of pork, you will see that it has been generally associated with tribal communities. And even now, in spite of the visibility and very easy availability in restaurants, if there is a ritual or a public function, if someone offers pork as in the menu, it creates a controversy. I remember in one of these Assam Literary Society's public function, there was pork served in one of these cities in Upper Assam, which is, also dominated by many indigenous communities. And there was a controversy where people said that they have served pork and we don't eat pork. This we was, people from the upper caste communities. And it became a controversy around how even today, when pork has become visible, and it often gets associated with what you should visit if you are visiting the Northeast, it continues to remain hierarchically ranked lower. So there are these internal dynamics at play in the region very much, which don't, get represented.
Hello,
I mean, it's a
ma'am.
long debate, but I'll also address some of these other questions if possible. There's a question on, is food and aesthetic linked? We can see it in the context of Dalit food culture in Mon. Yes, there is, an intricate relationship between food and aesthetics, primarily because historically the representations of food have been shared in a way where they are also supposed to be good looking. So where is this good looks coming from is this idea of presentation, right? Haute cuisine, as we know it, that gets presented and depicted in a particular way. This aesthetic is now more significant with the entry of the digital, because you find that digitally your food should look a particular way. However, what is also interesting is that when we think about, let's say, a traditional food, and the question of the rural comes in, there is this understanding that the authenticity is represented if the people are making it very very traditionally. I'll give an example. So there are a lot of these reels now on Instagram which you will find where people are shooting in their kitchens or their traditional kitchens, and they upload these videos as it is. The aesthetic that they are trying to promote then is this tradition, or what they would see as the rustic, rather than trying to also be modern, because this traditional aesthetic, as we like to see, is also something which is fashionable because primarily the idea of how we think about aesthetics as also a very class centered construct. Bourdieu has written a lot about taste and how it is connected to cultural capital. Aesthetics is a big part of that.
Hello, ma'am. Hello.
Yes, Anand. Yeah.
Ma'am, hello. Kumar Sain. I am a research scholar at Ambedkar Institute, Lucknow, and I have been working on the food culture and dietary habits of the Musahar community for the last 2 years in context of colonial to post-colonial time frame. During my fieldwork, I observed a complex dichotomy, the distinct food item that the Musahar community historically consumed as a survival strategy due to extreme poverty, or the exact same item that upper caste consume specifically during ritual fasting. So, ma'am, my question is, how do we methodologically differentiate these two consumption patterns? For one group, it is choice by driven by ritual purity, while for other, it was a compulsion driven by hunger. Ma'am, how do I frame this in our research without erasing the Musar struggle? Ma'am, I already pasted this question in chat box.
Yeah, I'm trying to read it just for better clarity. 1 second, okay? Mm.
Hello,
Interesting.
am I audible, ma'am?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I have put the message. This is not a kind of question, but I have one query that if you are the vegetarian, is it said that you are the civilized, and if you are a non-vegetarian, it is one belief in
Mhm.
Maharashtra that said that not only Maharashtra, but especially where many times see the you are non or the uncivilized. So how you can see towards this kind of philosophy
Okay.
or the beliefs? Yeah,
Yeah.
please.
Yes, I'll first answer Anand's question. I just read this. When we think about fasting, you're very right. It is a choice, and the survival is not. I think methodologically, that's your entry point in terms of how we think about choice. And choice, not only when it comes to food habits, choice is something which we are talking so much about today when it comes to, feminism also, right? What is this choice? That I think needs to be more theoretically, methodologically located. And what the Mushahar community eats, that is often also depicted from a lens of disgust that they eat rats. And that is theorized, written about to talk about, the community as basically being on the margins, right? And that they eat this. The explanation, which is social and economic, primarily doesn't really get covered, isn't it? The hunger, why, the destitution, etc. That is where I think your work as a researcher would be to uncover what made them eat rats. Survival is a very easy answer in that way. What can you say more from talking to people in the community because you have access to them to basically theorize, more on this? Okay, question of civilization, nutrition, etc. I think there are a bunch of questions around that, and I'll answer them together. Primarily, if we look at how this question of civilization has been seen, it has a colonial history. And when one thinks about taste in the Indian context, the colonizers had this idea that if they're able to transform Indian food habits, and they use the word Indian in the homogeneous sense, they will be able to, modernize our taste. What is that modernization of taste is basically giving up on our traditional foods and eating the way they do. A big part of that civilizational kind of transformation has also been seen when Western colonizers talk about populations in derogatory ways. They call tribal communities savage or primitive, and you will see that they're talking about their food habits with a lot of disgust, be it in Africa amongst the Australian Aborigines or Northeast India. They write about the tribals in ways that they eat blood and skin of pigs, etc. And we need to change their food habits. That is the civilizational practice at work where they want to transform what they think is raw into the cooked. If I adopt a structuralist framework, borrowing from people like Levi Strauss, one can also see this being explained that the raw gets transformed into the cooked through fire, and that is how they see the beginning of civilization. So meat in many cases become associated with representations of, the non-civilized or the uncivilized. I don't know if you remember, but there was this film called Padmavat, very controversial, and one of the scenes on the trailer had Alauddin Khilji eat a piece of meat in a very, very animalistic way, to use that term. And that was a depiction of how they think, the Muslims or Khilji ate, which would be completely removed from reality because he was a king at the end of the day. He would not be eating in that manner, right? But meat gets connected to that idea of uncivilization. And therefore, this desire or the idea to, civilize the food habits, which is why the detachment and the erasure. So I also see this in the question of, Northeast India, because this question also came up, that when there is a representation, people will talk about food items that they think are aesthetic looking or can fit into the, mainstream palette, but omit food items which maybe many communities hold as very near and dear to them because they don't see it as civilized enough. So this is one debate which could be basically theoretically analyzed through structuralism, as well as this question of nature and culture. Sherry Ortner has this essay called "Is Women to Nature What Men Is to Culture?" And she is making this point about, nature culture in terms of how biologically driven features make women more connected to nature, in terms of the biologically essentialist feminine arguments that feminist critiques later sort of debunk. But that is also an attempt at bringing in this question of civilization. So perhaps, if you could read that essay, that would also probably help you satiate your query. There is a question about, can there be Dalit food cultures? I think this question has no particular answer, but will be an ongoing conversation for many years now, because there will be different heterogeneities within Dalits, like the Northeast or Blacks or other communities. In this, I actually like to think of Virginius Khakha and what he said, that if we want to decolonize, tribal studies, he says that stop comparing tribes with other societies, look at them, as a society in its own self. So why should we be obsessed with comparing the tribes to mainstream society? And I think that approach is useful, because we can also talk about specific communities, the shifts, the continuities, and then adopt a comparative approach only to see the features of these communities, rather than use a civilizational scale to measure who eats what and what is better. The midday meal, there is a question on the midday meal. So the midday meal is a policy, and it has to be understood in the larger social cultural context, that whatever menu that is decided with this idea of what majority, and this majority becomes dominant and hegemonic, that they like. Sylvia Kalpagam, a public health advocate and nutritionist, have been talking about this for a long time, that the menu in the midday meal schemes don't reflect actual nutritional needs, but reflect the socio-cultural sensibilities of the dominant population in the Indian context. So this is something which is also, to be kept in mind, that these policies are not actually isolated. They are rooted in the socio-cultural context. So what is served in the menu of the midday meal is socially and culturally dictated.
There is also a question: can Gandhian idea of fasting be looked at through food studies?
Right. Yes, why not? If one is able to explore the philosophy behind fasting, as well as, connect it to the sociological implications, like Anand was mentioning, amongst the Mushahars, it could be fascinating that fasting for Gandhi is a tool of resistance, philosophically and politically. But for communities like the Mushahars, is it, even a choice or resistance, or is it survival, right? There is a good question right there. So, of course, you can adopt a food studies lens to study fasting. The colonial morality and the Brahminical notion, they are very intricately connected. And this is what I also said, in response to the previous question, that the erasure of what people ate and the textual analysis that, is there, presents the idea of how the margins have been erased, isn't it? We don't see these representations when the Indian nation state also attains independence, because there is erasure in that sense, right? Primarily, think about the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, and these are, very popular mythological epics. And the warrior communities, they're never shown to be eating meat on television, at least as far as I remember. And that is a big anomaly, because if you are living in the forest and you belong to the warrior community, it is not possible that you may not have, eaten meat, right? So that erasure is not just colonial, it is also post-colonial. I want to research how the Dalit community in Gujarat survived. Yes, it is possible to study sociologically if you can interview, do life history of people who maybe, let's say, are survivors or connected to that community. Somehow you have access. If you do an archival analysis, but I'm not sure if archives exist in this way, then it would be a historical study rather than a sociological one. But if you're able to do some primary research, let's say life history interviews or interviews, then it is possible to use the sociological approach.
Well, thank you so much, ma'am, for this insightful lecture and this ongoing debate and discussions. It's been almost more than 1 hour you are speaking. So it's very great. I have two major questions in my mind, and I think most of the researchers who are dealing with these food studies, they must be having this question in their mind. So the first question that I am interested to ask is what is your take on the representational ethics about the marginalized category food represent or supposedly you are coming from northeast and you are coming to this center of Delhi and all, and there is a kind of somehow marginalization of the food that you people are eating over there. So what kind of representational ethics can we take up for for the research? The second question that I am thinking of is the psychological mishappening that is going within one's mind, especially those who are coming from the marginalized communities. Uh, how, while they share their food with the dominant people or the people who are belonging to power holding community. So, this is two questions. If you could address, then it would be really great help for me. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. I think the question of representational ethic is very important, and that comes a lot in, the writing and the speaking, because you cannot say that don't study this or that. That becomes detrimental to knowledge itself. But be clear about your position, your entry point, your privilege, etc. And that is why the positionality I mentioned becomes an analytical tool itself to understand, certain social institutions. Because when Om Prakash Valmiki writes Juthan, he challenges the idea of this Dalit identity because he comes from that community. He's able to bring in how Jutha is connected to one's lived experience. That's why that entry point is very crucial. I will not be able to relate to him because I have not experienced that. I cannot claim to have lived experience of a Mushahari person because I have not had that. I can theorize on their behalf, but can I really produce
Exactly.
that lived experience? Isn't it?
Yeah.
So that is a big question. And therefore, when I am thinking about marginalized communities in my region, I am also very ethically stuck in the way that what kind of representational ethics can I bring in? Is it possible? And the responsibility sometimes also has to do with, if you are from some community or region, you have to do a better job, because people will look at you and think that you represent that ethics, and you will be questioned more. That is also a responsibility that unfairly people carry, which is a question that you might often get posed with, that why don't you work on caste if you belong to that community, or why don't you work on identity if you belong to this community, why don't you work on Muslims if you're a Muslim? That question of representative ethics is burdensome. But there's now a lot of discussion around it, especially in anthropology and sociology, which is like a welcome move. Not sure about how much it does on the field, but as long as we are able to also think through in terms of ideas collaboratively, I think we can still make certain interventions in terms of, representation is just the beginning. The rest all begins after that. I think that is, yeah, something that we have to think about. Almost all spaces are dominantly represented. So, and your privilege at one place may not be the privilege at other, but that doesn't mean you are not privileged. Again, that is also something to be thought about. So that the psychological part is, I think, something that I don't know. I'm not a psychologist, but what my understanding goes is that there is also this idea of asserting that, oh, we also do this, we also do that. And that comes from a deep sense of neglect, because you feel important enough to assert that, but not being listened to. So.
Yeah.
What approach can we take up while addressing this psychological mishappening going within the psyche of marginalized community people who are sharing food, especially with the upper caste or Savarna lobby people? Is there any?
Hmm. See, the responsibility is, I think, with the others to build tolerance and acceptance. These are things which are beyond food alone, isn't it? And if that doesn't happen, what can you do? Sometimes you have to still go and do the thing, because let's say you have the opportunity to serve people food. So, do you take their sensibilities into account, or do you also do something which you feel could be, a space for them to also engage better? Let me give an example. If there is a conference on Dalit food somewhere, and the menu doesn't include Dalit food items, what does it say? And maybe then it's time to think about whose sensibility are we talking about, isn't it?
Yeah.
And in this case, the organizers, everyone has a responsibility, because you're talking about it, but then have the items on the menu and, then see. I'm not saying everyone will like everything. That's not the question, isn't it?
That's
But
okay.
acceptance, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so there may be many questions, but so one has to stop somewhere. So uh, uh, thank you very much, Rituparna Patgiri, and it was so insightful. And the way you answered many questions with the examples, that shows your deep engagement with food study, both methodologically and field work that you have. It's really encouraged a new generation of scholars to take up this area very potential. And we have also begun to talk about food humanities. So and many new areas of studies are coming within the uh, food studies. Uh, and if you see the participants, 85 five participants participated in the online uh, discussion. That is more than what we have expected. That shows really that there is a lot of interest among the scholars uh, to understand food politics or politics of food, the subaltern food practices. So this lecture series we intended to continue. Uh, we will continue. We will be planning to do almost 10 to 15 lectures on 4th. We have a lecture by Dr. Ramchandra Reddy, who's a retired professor. He will be speaking on agrarian change and food practices among the Dalits or subaltern communities. On 10th, we have a lecture by Dr. Bamshidhar from Orissa on food there is an food and ethics. So he will be presenting. So we have many more lectures are going to come. Please follow the Satyashodhak Collective page and the Facebook wall for more updated lecture dates. So with this, we are very thankful to the Patgiri, Professor Dr. Patgiri, for very insightful, and we will keep in touch. I also suggest all the participants keep in touch with the speaker, and there are widely available her writings. We are going to upload this recorded presentation discussion in YouTube. You can also search so that for wider audience it will be available. On behalf of Satyashodhak Collective, on behalf of me and Dr. Anand and entire team, the Satyashodhak Collective is a group of scholars and publicly engaging scholars. So keep doing many activities, and please follow this YouTube link as well as the updated lecture that are going to come. With this, we thank everybody, and thank you very much.
So thank you all, and now we would come to at conclusion, and thank you so much. Bye for now.
हमसे प्यार ना करना लेटना भी नहीं जा फिर हम नमस्ते करो पहले बोलो